Welcome to Richard and Greg, a channel dedicated to discussion, debate and argument on a whole array of topics. Today we talk to Greg about nationalism versus patriotism, and we discuss those countries which practice each and what the common traits of nationalism actually are, and whether they are desirable or not. Let's listen to that discussion. Welcome to Richard and Greg. It's Tuesday, the 21st of July, 2020, and the time is 2000 hours GMT plus 1. And we're going to talk to Greg about the subject of nationalism. Now, before we do that, I shall give a dictionary definition of nationalism. It's the identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. Now, why nationalism is topical, particularly at the moment, is simply because it seems to be, or certainly the accusations are levied against President Donald Trump from adopting a nationalist policy, America first, at the cost and expense to other nations around the world. But we've also seen this happen in Britain too, particularly over the recent Brexit debacle, whereby Britain thought that its best interests were to come out of the European Union and therefore have been accused of being Little Englanders or British nationalists. Now, I think it's worth asking Greg, is nationalism a dirty word? Because political opponents certainly wish to use it as such, and what he understands nationalism to be. So, Greg, good evening. The floor is yours.
Good evening. It's an interesting day from the point of view of nationalism, which has been continuing for increasingly for 2 or 3 years, but on both sides of the Atlantic. I would like to call you out on one comment you made there, Richard, which was the debacle of Brexit. I would say that we have had an outrageous success in liberating ourselves from vassal status within a supranational, centralized, effectively dictator committee that has cost a huge amount to very little benefit of the United Kingdom, be that any part of the United Kingdom. Nationalism is, as your dictionary definition said, interest in one's own country to the detriment of other countries. I would far rather look on things like Brexit, where Britain liberated itself from the European Union, and I'd rather look on that as patriotism than nationalism, because I think it would be a truer reflection. Patriotism has the advantage of being open, welcoming, and friendly to all those who are allies and wish to promote a given country. Nationalism is exclusive, will tread on anyone for the sake of one's own narrow interests. There is a great deal of difference between the two. Patriotism is something to be proud of, namely one's own country. Nationalism is based far more on hatred of other people's countries.
Okay, Greg, when you said you call me out, I mentioned debacle of Brexit, not necessarily meaning the decision was a debacle, but about how the whole situation has been conducted since the actual vote to come out of the European Union. Okay, so you mentioned patriotism versus nationalism. So President Trump, what sort of policy has he been following? And would you declare it nationalist or being a patriot?
I would declare President Trump's policy as self-interest, in that if he can stir up the folly and hatred that represents nationalism, then he can divide his country, be that on grounds of colour, race, or religion, to maximize his own personal chances of being re-elected. I don't think he's a patriot. I think he is a self-interested nationalist. And I think an awful lot of people will follow that line on the basis that give a child the encouragement of one adult and they'll take on the world. It doesn't mean to say that those individuals have a clue of the dangers behind what Trump is doing for the world, but more especially for their own country in the long run.
Okay. Now, we have some good examples of countries following nationalistic sort of principles. The Second World War being a prime example, and what we witnessed in Germany. Does nationalism work? And if it doesn't, Greg, what's the alternative?
Nationalism works for a small clique in the position of power within a given country for their personal gain, but for their own national benefit, it is in the main a disaster, and has proved to be in almost every instance. We see the nationalism of the Cultural Revolution in China that killed 50 million plus of its own people. We see the nationalism of the communist regime after the revolution in Russia and subsequently the Soviet Socialist Republic that killed roughly the same number of people of their own peoples. We see the nationalism that has been manifest in Venezuela. We see the nationalism that has kept the people of Cuba in poverty. We see the nationalism of many regimes in Africa, where nationalism is more manifest in real terms by tribalism. But is that any different to the tribalism of America?
Okay, but what about this idea of buying American only? Or we adopted it in this country, buy British. Is there not an innate natural tendency for us all to be nationalists?
I don't think that's necessarily nationalist. That may well be patriotic. It may be supporting your own industries rather than supporting the industries of other countries. Nationalism, an example of that was the conservative governments of the 1960s, in order to preserve the British furniture industry, used taxpayers' money and issued an edict that all government departments and government organizations would renew their furniture every 3 years, or a third of their furniture every year, whichever way you wish to look at it, to keep the British furniture industry going, because that maintained a huge number of jobs. It also maintained sufficient turnover to make it viable to have exports and earn money, to create taxation, etc. Harold Wilson's government came in. They looked at this and said, this should be going to the lowest tender. This is self-interest on the part of the Tories. And it ended up that we were buying a third of the furniture for every government department, until somebody corrected the folly, from Taiwan mainly. That was rather foolish, I would submit, because of the nationalist socialist streak that was running through the government of its day. Patriotism would welcome other people's products, but not to the exclusion of their own. They would welcome purchasing from other countries, but to some extent with reciprocity. The aim is not to dominate the other countries. The aim is to benefit both yourself and your allies. That is patriotism. That is something to be proud of. That is the basis throughout most of its modern history of the Commonwealth, which interestingly, numerous countries very much chose to join. And off the top of my head, I can't think of one that chose not to be in it if they were entitled to be, because it works on a patriotic basis, not on a nationalist basis. Fair play, fair trade.
So what countries would you say were more nationalist than patriotic?
Well, I did run through a list of them: Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, the Soviet Union as it became. I would say that at the moment, Turkey, Syria, Iran, and other countries in the Middle East. I would say that the basically Zionist end of the Israeli government, I would say a number of countries in Africa, are all particularly nationalistic. Whether that's based on tribal or religious grounds really doesn't make a lot of difference.
But that's the odd thing that strikes me. We now have almost instantaneous telecommunications. We have transport systems, obviously coronavirus accepted, but we have transport systems where we could never get around the world faster than we do now. So this whole concept of trading with others, dealing with others, has never been so easy. And yet these countries adopt nationalistic instincts. How would you explain that?
Stupidity.
Go on, you'll have to elaborate further than that.
You only need to look at the dire straits at present of the people of Venezuela as they seek almost any way to feed themselves, and literally millions have crossed their borders to leave their own country to try to find work and food in other countries, mainly their neighbors. But that is one of the great drawbacks of nationalism, because the power ends up in the hands of a few corrupt people, as it's done in Russia.
Well, before we finish this podcast, Greg, you've mentioned Russia. Now, there was a report published by the UK government today about potential Russian interference, mainly in the last general election, but since, I believe, 2014 elections. Can you just give our audience a sort of just outline as to what that report was about, and in very concise terms, what it actually said?
Caveat, it was only published today. I have skim-read parts of it. I have not read the whole thing, but in outline, it was a government report into research done as to whether Russia had interfered in British elections, and if so, to what extent. It would appear to have become apparent that there was very little extent that they managed to interfere successfully, but there was notable evidence claimed by the report that they interfered fairly heavily in 2014 in the Scottish referendum, where the Scottish Nationalist Party was seeking power for its leadership to take Scotland into independence and try to gain membership of the European Union in its own right, so that it had somebody else to fill its begging bowl. Meanwhile, giving a small number of fairly extremist politicians who had reached their position largely by dividing their own region, just as has happened in Wales, and denigrating anybody who dared to step over the line and say how foolish it was to look in terms of independence for a region of the United Kingdom that fundamentally didn't have an economy that would support itself and would lose a huge amount of jobs and many benefits when they found themselves behind a hard border with the rest of the United Kingdom. These people who were looking to do this, I submit, were assisted by Russia. Russia wishing harm to its enemies, namely the United Kingdom. And also, I don't think one can be remotely surprised that this occurs, because the weapons of the Cold War are predicated on it turning into a hot war as a permanent threat, whereas the weapons of this particular Cold War are merely computer hacking, bots, and fake accounts to promote various aspects of one's country's desires. I am not surprised that this has occurred. I'm quite surprised it hasn't occurred more. The report itself has shown there was interference by Russia in the 2014 referendum, but that there was very little traceable interference in other referenda and elections, general elections in the United Kingdom, just as the report in America on Russian interference has fallen somewhat flat, showing that it is claimed that Trump's organization was not supported by Russia. And despite the great deal of saber rattling on all sides, at the end of the day, Russia is not at fault if it does act in its own interest. However, it is the citizens of the country concerned that accept the bribes and benefits provided by Russia, because that is anti-patriotic and damaging to one's own country, even though it is done in the name of nationalism, because people don't realize how evil nationalism can be.
And I think that is a wonderful note on which to end this discussion. Greg, as always, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Lots more to read in that report and draw your own conclusions.
Thank you, Greg. We hope you enjoyed that discussion, and if so, kindly subscribe to our channel and press the bell sign so that you are notified of our videos as and when they are published. And also in the description box below, we place links to certain books, articles, and programs which you may find of benefit, and for which we will receive a small commission should you purchase through our link. And this will help support our channel and to enable us to develop it further.